Hoy, en nuestra primera sesión, trataremos la colonización francesa y la experiencia de Nueva España. Para ello nos acompaña el profesor Pradip Datta, profesor de la Universidad de Delhi, y el profesor Mamadou Diouf, profesor de la Universidad de Columbia, Nueva York. El profesor Ricardo Peñaranda moderará esta mesa. Les damos la palabra.
Wait. Professor Datta, you commence? Okay. Buenos días, gracias a todos por su asistencia. Vamos a iniciar la sesión con algunos minutos de retraso. Vamos a tener 4 presentaciones en la mañana de hoy. Inicialmente, el profesor Pradip Datta hará su presentación sobre el tema las lógicas coloniales de las identidades en conflicto. El profesor Datta, como ya se mencionó, es profesor del Departamento de Ciencias Políticas de la Universidad de Delhi. A continuación, después de la presentación del profesor Datta, el profesor Mamadou Diouf hará su presentación sobre el tema de identidades coloniales y ciudadanía en el caso del enclave francés del Atlántico del Senegal. Después de estas 2 presentaciones haremos un receso. Como está previsto, al cabo de las presentaciones pueden ir presentando las preguntas, preparando las preguntas, haremos una selección de preguntas. Después del receso tendremos 2 exposiciones sobre el caso de Indochina y el caso de Argel. De manera que iniciamos la sesión de hoy con la presentación del profesor Pradip Datta.
Gracias. Firstly, I would like to follow the other speakers to thank Professor Bonilla for this opportunity to attend this extremely important conference and also to encounter one of the most interesting things I've seen in my life, which is to have such a long conference and such a large hall and to have very packed halls with extremely attentive students. It's quite a wonderful sight to have. I also wish to thank Lena and the other many student volunteers who have made our lives very comfortable in this city. So thank you, all of you. My title is Colonial Domination and the Logic of Conflictual Identities in India. As a student, when I was taught the problem of Hindu-Muslim conflicts, which we call communalism in India, and which I will broadly call conflictual identities, we only studied how Muslims organize themselves in a sectarian way, and how this process intensified to partition the country and to realize the ambition of Muslims to acquire a separate state called Pakistan. As you might know, in 1947, India was partitioned, the year of our independence, into 2 halves. We were told that this process was due not just to Muslim organization, but above all to the British, who stimulated the Muslim League, that is the party of the Muslims, into existence and saw to it that they became a mass party. In other words, communalism was seen as the product of British policies, although it operated through Indian, dominantly Muslim subjects. There was a silent assumption that now, in the post-colonial period, after independence, there would be no more such conflicts. However, this belief was broken by the rise of Hindu communal mobilization, that was anti-Muslim mobilization, that took place in the late 1980s and 1990s. A period that coincided with liberalization, globalization, and the increasing power of the middle class. The most striking feature of this mobilization was its unprecedented success in redefining the Indian nation as a Hindu nation, especially among the new middle classes. Now, the recurrence of Hindu nationalism and its violent anti-Muslim as well as anti-Christian mobilization was accompanied by a new wave of scholarship that tried to understand the general precondition for the production of such conflicts under colonialism. Scholars such as Sudipta Kaviraj, Gyanendra Pandey, and to some extent Partha Chatterjee, among others, successfully explained how, instead of successfully explained how identities and the sense of community boundaries hardened under colonialism, so that instead of possessing multiple relationships with other communities, each community saw itself as monolithic, with harsh and clear boundaries and clearly defined identities of their own. They explained this transformation by the impact of colonial knowledge systems, especially the census. These knowledge systems were based on enumeration and classification by religion, above all. Despite the contribution of these scholars, I do not feel that enough attention has been paid to the self-perpetuating nature of this phenomenon that makes it recur in post-colonial situations. What accounts for the formation of conflictual identities that could allow these to retain their power even after the departure of colonialism? Could it be fully explained by colonialism and its system of domination? If these identities could reappear after 30 years or so of relative inter-community peace following the independence in 1947, should the assumption that colonial domination was responsible for the processes of communal conflict be re-examined? Let me anticipate my argument here. Colonial governance impacted in three fundamental ways on the colonized in this particular history of conflictual identities. These were the spheres of the census, of governmental policies regarding employment and political representation, and thirdly, the economic policies that promoted commercialization in both urban and rural economies. However, the effect of these are variable. These can stimulate processes that are not fully explicable by colonial processes and which can indeed pose an embarrassment to the government. Or these processes could be decisive in a different conjuncture, releasing processes of conflicts that colonial governance needed only to manage for its own advantage. The fact that Hindu communal mobilization appealed a great deal to the new Indian middle class raised a second question. How did conflictual identities under colonialism relate to class? Scholars, especially Pandey, Gyan Pandey, Partha Chatterjee, and some of my work, have shown how communal identities related to other identities in a situation where identities had, in general, hardened and become self-isolating. This scholarship critiqued and revised the orthodox Marxist understanding of community-class relationship that said that communalism was a form of false consciousness of real material class interests. Partha Chatterjee's work is of particular importance here. In a series of articles produced mainly in the 1980s and 1990s, Chatterjee argued that the community form in colonial India did not die away. Indeed, it had the capacity to survive various changes in modes of production. Further, the community was the dominant mode of collectives in India since it had the capacity to absorb and express class interests. Hence, communities were variable because they absorbed different class interests specific to particular localities and regions. But their basic elements, rooted in a normative, moral, regulative regime, remained the same. In other words, community absorbs class. Chatterjee's conception of the community-class relationship can be called the container view of community because it contains all kinds of other things, including class specifically. As against this, I will try to show that community and class enter into several entangled combinations. It is the phenomenon of these combinations that mark at least one critical element of the specificities of the Indian colonial experience. The idea of combination involves the following features. One, that community and class are neither expressions of one another nor containers for the other. So neither the Marxist nor the Chatterjee view. Instead, they retain their differences even as they become entangled with one another. Two, that both community and class have different histories as social forces. Communities change in character because of the shifts in colonial impact, and these changes in the character of the community also result in different relationships with class. To sum up, what I will try to do today is to examine the nature and extent of colonial domination by examining the ways in which it shapes or does not shape the relationship between community and class. I will look at two broad historical periods in which the combination of community and class is established and revised in the history of conflictual identities. Excuse me. There were two sites of communal conflict in the early colonial period. I basically divided it between the early colonial period and the mature colonial period, just as a kind of simple sort of classification. Now, there were two sites of communal conflict in the early colonial period. These corresponded to different combinations of community and class. The first source was the Islamic reform movements that had long-standing lineages in the thought of the ulema in the Mughal world. This movement exerted a great influence in the first half of the 19th century through the Tariqa-e-Muhammadiyya movement, popularly referred to by its opponents as the Wahhabis. Sayyid Ahmad, a militant jihadi, vigorously led the movement to return to the fundamentals of the Quran and the Hadith and to purify un-Islamic customs that had, according to them, corrupted the Muslims living in a predominantly non-Muslim country. It is in this connection that Sayyid Ahmad entered into a jihad against the Sikhs, a large non-Islamic religious sect in northern India, as well as the British to accomplish their objectives. The reformist campaign, I should also add, brought them into conflict with the majority Sunni Muslims. Now, the Tariqa movement introduced a programmatic idea of community. Community was premised on a project to renew the early community of Muhammad. By itself, this was not something that really expresses any class commitments. Indeed, the targets of the new reform movements are quite indiscriminate in class terms. Nevertheless, interestingly, there were two other reform movements that took place in the eastern part of India, in Bengal, in roughly the same period, that is in the 1830s. These were equally committed to producing exclusive communities of reformers who dressed differently from their co-religionists, observed their own particular Islamic customs, in addition to purging what they saw as un-Islamic practices, such as the worship of holy men or peers. What is important for us is that they were also deeply inflected by class imperatives. Gathering together mainly weavers and small peasantry, these movements targeted not just British planters but also Hindu landlords. They attacked the zamindars, that is the Hindu landlords, in the idiom that they could improvise from the grammar of religious ideas. That is, they attacked the market and private temples of the zamindar, that is the landlord, as well as desecrated these with cow's blood. And cow is held to be a sacred animal amongst the Hindus. In turn, this gave to the Hindu landlord a certain representative status as Hindu rather than landlord. I should add that British land policies had benefited a large class of highly oppressive landlords who became intensively extractive revenue farmers. This obviously intensified the conditions of peasant exploitation. Let me underline the following points. The first is that the turn to a programmatic idea of community